Please take your seats. News Shapers is about to begin. Grab a seat. News Shapers will begin shortly.
Every day, every single day, things are happening in the world of deals and deal makers. And there's never enough time to keep up with every company, transaction, announcement, or whatever. It's just exhausting. And we have a new product to help fix that. This is Axios Pro Deals, a new premium subscription product bringing you tailor-made insights like never before. For the last 5 years, Axios has helped deal professionals navigate the whole deal landscape with Pro Rata. With Axios Pro Deals, we're diving deeper into the industries that matter most to you. You just want stories on fintech? There's a newsletter for that. MedTech deals? We've got you covered. The future of retail? We'll guide you. With Axios Pro Deals, you're going to be getting all of this industry-specific insight and expert analysis at a level you simply can't get anywhere else. So if you're a venture capitalist, private equity investor, banker, trader, founder, executive, anyone who cares about deals, Axios Pro is what you need to help you understand what matters and why. Start your free trial today at AxiosPro.com.
A reminder to refrain from using flash photography and remember to silence all cell phones. We ask all attendees to please be respectful to our guests and moderators. Don't forget. A reminder to refrain from using flash photography and remember to silence all cell phones. We ask all attendees to please be respectful to our guests and moderators. Don't forget, join the conversation online using hashtag Axios Events and enjoy the show.
Welcome aboard.
To kick off this morning's program, please welcome Axios Global Technology Correspondent Ryan Heath.
Good morning, everyone. I am thrilled to be with you making my Axios events debut. We have got a lot to cover in the next 15 minutes. We're going to look at the state of AI, security by design, and the need for the US government to collaborate. And we've got a real news shaper joining me on stage right now, the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Jen Easterly. Welcome, Jen. Let's start with a little bit of the news of the day.
Yeah.
A lot of people have been thinking debt ceiling, but I'm going to divert it slightly to the budget, which is what underpins all of these debates.
Yeah.
You've asked for $3.1 billion, or rather the White House has, for CISA. That's literally less than pennies on the dollar on what is being spent overall when you look in the context of the national debt. How confident are you that you're going to get the money you need to keep us safe?
Well, first of all, was really encouraged about the deal. Look forward to that being passed. The U.S. obviously has to meet our obligations. We have enjoyed incredible bipartisan congressional support since CISA was established at the end of 2018. Since I came on board, our budget has grown by $1 billion. We've hired 1,105 people, being good stewards of that budget. And the hack mark, frankly, was pretty close to what the president expected, and the appropriations hearing went very well. So I believe we will get the resources that we need to help defend the nation in cyber.
And you're up on the Hill later this morning.
Yeah.
But briefly run us through the risk. If you don't get it, what are the consequences? Are we back to a pre-SolarWinds situation? What is the risk if you don't get this money?
I do worry about our ability to defend the nation, to work with critical infrastructure to keep us safe and resilient in the face of increasingly complex and dynamic cyber threats. As you know, we published a product along with our Five Eyes partners last week on a Chinese threat actor on our critical infrastructure. These are the types of threats that we need to be prepared to defend against. And that's why continuing to resource our budget is so incredibly important.
And last question on this, is that about giving Republicans who are a bit concerned about how much is being spent on taxpayer dime, are you needing to give them more detail about what you're spending this money on? What are the sort of things they're asking for reassurance?
I mean, again, we have provided a lot of information that supports our budget. It was a very collaborative budget hearing with our appropriations subcommittee, very good meetings with all of them. And whatever questions they have, we'll continue to provide them information, but I'm very confident that cybersecurity will remain a bipartisan congressional issue, and we're grateful for it.
Thank you for that. We'll now move to security by design. I know that's a favorite topic of yours.
It is.
Today, the burden is just really on consumers, fighting off all sorts of online scams and threats. How much of that burden has to shift to the tech companies? So, and what do you want them to take charge of?
Right. So this is really about technology product safety, and it's a core element of what we need for a more sustainable approach for cybersecurity. We've been talking about cyber hygiene for years. It's very important at the individual and at the enterprise level, but given the threat environment, well-resourced, sophisticated nations, a lowered bar to entry to cyber criminals, we can't PSA our way out of this. At the end of the day, we need to do something different, and the stakes are very high. It's not just scams and fraud. It is the critical infrastructure that we rely upon every hour of every day to get water and power and healthcare and transportation and communications. All of this is now underpinned by a technology base that, frankly, is insecure based on decades of misaligned incentives. We're all about speed to market and features, not safety and security. And so what we're calling for is for technology manufacturers, software producers, to start taking accountability for the safety outcomes of their consumers and creating products that are both secure by design, meaning built to reduce the number of exploitable flaws, and secure by default, meaning they come to us out of the box with secure features like multi-factor authentication. And this is about the burden shifting. So essentially, we're solving problems upstream when products are designed or before they're designed, as opposed to putting all of that burden on the individual user or that small business. And this is the product we released a couple months ago with 6 of our international partners. We've been working with industry on it. And it's really about sending a clear market signal both to those software producers and technology manufacturers as well as to consumers, so we know the right questions to ask so that we can have products that are more safe and secure.
But in the absence of Congress or the courts putting a big liability on these companies, what's the business incentive for them to do that? I'm a CEO. Why would I do what you ask if that's just going to cost me money?
That's exactly the right question, right? It's all about misaligned incentives. As I said, the short history of information technology is about incentives that are all about speed to market and features. That's why we have an internet with viruses. It's why we have software with flaws. It's why we have social media with disinformation. And it's why I'm particularly concerned about the rapid deployment of large language models. But at the end of the day, this really has to be about businesses doing the right thing for their consumers. And businesses do want to do that. They do want to create safe products. But at the end of the day, there hasn't been a clear market signal. So why we're calling in our paper for radical transparency so that people understand what is a safe product, what does secure by design mean, and they can ask for it, something that's never happened before. My son just graduated from high school this past weekend, yay, and we're looking at buying him a used car. You wouldn't buy a car today without seatbelts and airbags. Why do we accept products that come full of flaws that can be exploited by threat actors, where we have to constantly update to a new version of software, constantly patch? Why do we accept that? Why do we accept products where we have to press a user agreement of 17 pages of legalese that we don't read, just saying, this is, I'm liable for this. So we can't accept that anymore.
That brings us really, you mentioned large language models, to all of the developments in generative AI over the past 6 months. And we've had literally hundreds of experts multiple times, most recently a letter yesterday, saying this could be an extinction event. So is Sam Altman and CEOs like him, are they trying to have their cake and eat it? Because they're not building secure by design products right now. And then they're warning us that there could be an extinction event.
Yeah, so I would look at AI as yet another flavor of technology that has to be built security upfront, safety upfront. I see the world through 3 decades of intelligence, counterterrorism, and cybersecurity. And at the end of the day, these capabilities will do amazing things. They'll make our lives easier and better. They'll make lives easier and better for our adversaries, who will flood the space with disinformation, who will be able to create cyber attacks and all kinds of weapons. And the history of this, from a leadership perspective, I think about we have to be able to leverage the power of imagination and avoid the failure of imagination. We have to do both. And so leaders like Sam Altman and others who signed this letter of 350 people yesterday, posted on the Center for Safe AI, 22 words. It essentially says, mitigating the risk of extinction from AI must be a global priority along the scale of societal problems like nuclear war and pandemics. If you actually think that these capabilities can lead to extinction of humanity, well, let's come together and do something about it. And I know we've been calling for regulation, exactly.
But they could invite CISA into OpenAI and other company doors right now, couldn't they?
And we are having discussions. We are having discussions. You wrote a really good piece this morning about how difficult it is for governments and bureaucracies to actually implement regulation and to do it right. At the end of the day, I would ask these 350 people and the makers of AI, while we're trying to put a regulatory framework in place, think about self-regulation. Think about what you can do to slow this down so we don't cause an extinction event for humanity.
Now, thinking about how the threat landscape that you deal with has changed over the last 6 months because of AI, I wonder if you think it's fair to say that the barrier to entry is now much lower for malicious non-state actors, those sort of rogue people that aren't backed by a state, but also the ceiling is now higher for the really sophisticated state adversaries that the United States has. What worries you most given those new dynamics?
Yeah. I mean, I worry about the whole range of things because I have to, both in terms of physical threats as well as cyber threats. I mean, our job is to reduce risk to critical infrastructure. I think the two epoch-defining challenges of our time are artificial intelligence and China. Yep. And we put out a product last week about Chinese incursions into critical infrastructure. I think that is a real wake-up call for our concerns about why we need to increase the security and resilience of our critical infrastructure. You only need to read the annual threat assessment from the intelligence community, which talks about in the event of a conflict, like an invasion or a blockade of the Taiwan Straits, we will almost probably see aggressive cyber operations here in the US and almost probably capable of disrupting transportation, oil and pipelines designed to delay military deployment and to induce societal panic. And so we need to take this very seriously as a nation, both from a cybersecurity perspective, but frankly, from a societal resilience perspective. Our systems need to be resilient, our people need to be resilient. That's frankly the big lesson learned from Ukraine, the incredible resilience of the Ukrainian people.
Now, of all the agencies in government, CISA is one of the biggest partnership agencies. Like, you really can't do your work without that collaboration with tech companies and telecoms operators and whoever it might be on critical infrastructure. What are you asking them to do to mitigate the risks? You know, beyond the, we need to be thinking about this, like what ask do you go and make to those executives to say, let's not have another Chinese incursion?
Yeah, I mean, it really has to be a partnership. And so we've frankly tried to transform the paradigm. We've been talking about public-private partnership for decades, and it's become a bit meaningless and a bit hackneyed. So what we have been working on is persistent operational collaboration through platforms like our Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, the JCDC. And it's really three things, Ryan. It's a default to share, recognizing that in our highly connected, highly vulnerable world, a threat to one is a threat to all. It's a co-equal partnership with government and industry with reciprocal expectations of transparency, value added, and a sharing of information, and industry shouldn't feel like they're going to be punished, right? We should treat victims like victims, not blame and shame them. And the engagement with government has to be frictionless. We need to be able to share platforms, share analytics, so that we can put pieces of the puzzle together, that tapestry of the threat, to drive down risk to the nation. So we are asking for a trusted partnership, and we are approaching it with humility and transparency and responsiveness, knowing that we always have to add value as a government.
Now, speaking of frictionless government relationships, one that isn't is between the US and China. What lines of communication do you have with Beijing to de-escalate if something does go wrong?
Yeah, so we are the cyber defenders. That is our job. I would leave that to the White House and the State Department.
Okay, so
in terms
of Jake Sullivan has the line to Beijing. We'll leave it there at that one. You mentioned that you had put out this joint advisory with the Five Eyes Alliance about the nature of the threats that come from China and other adversarial states. Do you think that is really putting infrastructure operators at the center of a geopolitical bullseye?
Well, I think that this further puts them at the center of the political bullseye. I mean, in the run-up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and during the barbaric Russian war in Ukraine, we have warned about critical infrastructure being vulnerable to Russian malicious cyber activity. That was part of our nationwide Shields Up campaign about the threat and then how we can mitigate the threat. And it really has to be a partnership. Private industry can't do it, government can't do it, we have to do it together. And this is just another extension of that. And I would, anybody who's a business owner or a critical infrastructure owner operator, please read that product at CISA.gov. It tells you what you need to do to mitigate the threat, and then other best practices from a cybersecurity perspective. So really important that we all are in this together.
Now, thinking about all the many threats that you deal with, if you have to nominate one, what is the one that is most keeping you up at night? And then given that we don't live in a secure by design world, and everyone here in this room does have to manage online threats that they face, what is the one tip that you would leave for people here where we need to be on guard to protect ourselves online?
Well, I don't sleep very much. I used to be the head of counterterrorism, and so you get used to sort of your 4 or 5 hours of sleep. But I do worry about the big threat of China, and I do worry about AI. I mean, when you have 350 experts coming out and saying there's a potential for extinction of humanity, I think there's a lot to worry about there, right? And so we need to rapidly get our arms around this. And then before we get secure by design products, and by the way, industry is moving in that direction. We need to continue the revolution. But before we do that, if you're going to do one thing, enable multi-factor authentication on all of your sensitive accounts. Please do it today if you don't already have it. And then we're rapidly moving into a world of passkeys where it will actually be really easy to do, but until it is, do that. And I'll also add, get a password keeper to protect all your unique, complex passwords.
There you go. And our wonderful cybersecurity reporter, Sam Sabin, wrote all about passkeys yesterday, so you can catch more of those details on Axios.com. We're out of time. Thank you very much, Jen Easterly. We very much appreciated the conversation. And please stay tuned for our next segment after a short video from our sponsor, Bank of America. Thank you, Jen.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
In South Carolina, we spend about $1 billion a year housing and maintaining prisons. When we think about the hundreds of thousands of dollars that we're pouring into somebody to keep them incarcerated, but not educating them, and then we're just continuing to send guys back to prison because when they get out with no education, they recidivate. I got sentenced to 20 years in prison for some drug felonies back in 1995. While I was in prison, I started researching to figure out what happens to people when they get out of prison. This is something that the average American citizen does not think about. In the whole of America, there are 48,000 collateral consequences, meaning there are things, fines and fees, housing issues that people with criminal backgrounds face when they get out of prison. For 3.5 years, I wrote the vision of Satiric Community Development Corporation, and we try to move those barriers out of the way so it can be easier for people to live life and climb the economic mobility ladder in America. Those of us who are working in nonprofit sector, all of our money goes toward our mission. It goes toward boots on the grounds, programs and projects. Getting funding from private sectors like Bank of America and others is so important because it fills the gap. We have a 96% success rate. Our recidivism is only 4%. For the last 22 years, we've helped over 5,000 men successfully transition from prison to being a successful citizen, prepared for the real world.
Next up, introducing Axios politics reporter Sophia Kai.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin, I should say we've invited many of the other Republican presidential candidates to join us at Axios, and we look forward to hosting them as their schedule allows. Our next guest needs no introduction. He is running for President of the United States. Please join me in welcoming Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. Senator, thank you so much.
Certainly. Good to be
Thank
here.
you so much for joining
ma'am.
us.
Howdy.
So, at Axios, we love to start with the news. Today, the House will vote on the debt ceiling. Will you vote to raise the debt ceiling?
Short answer is no. The long answer is when I think about what's in the deal, I find that two things are really important. Number one, that Kevin did a good job of figuring out how to negotiate with someone who did not want to negotiate. The question I ask myself is, at the end of the negotiation, is it in our best interest as a nation to allow Joe Biden, someone we cannot trust on spending, to have an open checkbook, no limit on the credit card until the end of his term? And my answer is no. So the fact that the current deal allows for him to continue to spend however much he does with no limit is something that I can't support. You look backwards as well as forward. The one thing you'll see is last cycle, he had a $1.2 trillion deficit. This fiscal year, a $2 trillion deficit. I can't imagine what we're looking at the next fiscal year if, in fact, there's no limit on the credit card. So you think about that. And the second thing I say is that as a guy who was raised by a single mom in poverty, my mother taught me one thing that was really important after her 16-hour shifts. There's dignity in work, and to not have every able-bodied person going back to work as a part of the deal is something that I just don't support.
Well, they have added work requirements, and to be clear, you would risk this country going to default.
No, actually, I'd say it differently. Let me go here, preach out here for a little while here. Yeah, so for me, the way I look at it is that June 5th is the day that we have today. So what we know is that in order for us to not have ourselves to default, we have to have a minimum of around $25 to $30 billion in an account. So the question is, can America make it through the next several days without defaulting? The answer is simply yes. We said it was June 1st, now it's June 5th. The truth is by June 15th, we were having revenues coming, and by June 30th, we have a lot more coming. And those folks who extended their taxes from March 15th into June 30th by July 15th. So there's a 3 or 4 day window where the revenues coming in are sufficient that we should be concerned. We should be concerned, without any question. Will we default? No. Is there a way to get a deal done where the President of the United States does not have unlimited spending power and creating more debt and more dependency on China? My answer is yes, we can. There's a way for us to get it done. We celebrate in this current deal a $1.4 billion freeze on spending for the IRS. 87,000 new agents won't be coming this cycle, this fiscal year. But the next one, we could see that happening. And so whether some celebrate the $1.4 billion, which, okay, it's $82 billion that we gave to the IRS to hire those folks, $45 billion going towards
and you take
the funding
back COVID funds, unused COVID funds.
Yeah,
I mean, and it cuts spending year over year.
Yes, here's what I say. It doesn't actually cut spending. What would happen is it would revert back to spending if it fell apart by January 2025. So for the next 15 months, 17 months or so, we would have unlimited spending with no ceiling whatsoever. So I'm not the person who believes that if you have a record of a $1.2 trillion deficit followed by a $2 trillion deficit, I'm not going to give you the ability to have a $3 trillion deficit when we have $31 billion of debt or $94,000 per person. I think that's just too much.
Where do you think your Republican colleagues are on this issue?
Well, I saw last night that many of the more conservative members of the House seem to have fallen in line
Freedom Caucus,
to support it. So that's a good sign for Kevin's ability to negotiate. I think I give him a lot of credit for, especially the NEPA reforms that he's looking at. In America today, it could take between 7 and 10 years for a highway project to actually start turning dirt because of all of the requirements. Getting ourselves in a position where that 7-year window comes down to 2 years is progress. Freezing $1.4 billion or eliminating to $1.4 billion for the IRS for the next year is progress. Yeah. But comparatively speaking to where we are as a country, we bring in $5 trillion in revenues, but we spend $7 trillion. That's a 40% deficit. How do you ever get your fiscal house in order if you continue to spend at a breakneck speed?
I want to move on to your campaign. I mean, you're doing something very unusual, talking about optimism. It's who you are as a person. But it's very different than the frontrunners. Trump, DeSantis, they're all having a very negative conversation. Can that work?
Yes, it can work. Hallelujah! It always works.
But I mean, look, is that what voters want? Is that what primary voters will want?
I'm hoping the answer is yes, Sophia. That's why I'm on the campaign trail. The one thing I'm learning as I go to Iowa, New Hampshire, and throughout South Carolina, the early voting states, is that people are starving for something optimistic. They want to have an optimistic, positive conversation as long as it's anchored in conservative principles and you have a backbone. People don't want just positivity, but I do think that sometimes we confuse meekness with weakness. There is nothing weak about being meek and understanding that if we don't care who gets the credit, America moves forward. What we need in this nation today is someone who persuades. Fighting is good, winning is better. And that's my theory. And so what we need is a president who persuades the American people to have a conversation about common ground leading to common sense so that one nation under God, indivisible, is our future. I will take that message to the mountaintops and I'll take it into the valleys. This past Sunday, I took it to a black church and had a conversation with a very diverse audience in this black church about why as a Republican do we support and care about minority issues? Why is it that we find ourselves so tribal in America? I wanted to have a conversation because I think you should be the kind of candidate that you hope to be president. You shouldn't change the way you approach the job once you have the job. If you're not willing to go to work on day one talking to voters who may not vote for you, I think you're not looking to represent the entire American public. My goal is to make sure that all of America recognizes, I want to be your president, I want to be your servant. And if I don't show up on the campaign trail, it's probably disingenuous.
And I want to get back to the other candidates in a bit, but on the issue of foreign policy.
Yes, ma'am.
What would victory look like in Ukraine?
Yes. So I'd say a couple things here. One of the things that we haven't had from the President of the United States today is articulating what is America's national vital interest in Ukraine. At the same time that we have not articulated our national vital interest in Ukraine, we still have real problems on our southern border. And so the American people find this level of frustration growing intently. And so one of the things that we should do is identify what is America's national vital interest in Ukraine. In my opinion, and it's really simple, degrading the Russian military is in America's national vital interest. Every single time we have an opportunity to decimate Russia's military, we make the home front safer. We are also, of course, part of NATO, which means an attack on one is attack on all. Every time we reduce the ability of Putin to attack NATO territory that's contiguous with Ukraine, we find ourselves in the strongest possible position to prevent an escalation that would cause us to have boots on the ground. So for me, as President of the United States, articulating why we're there, what victory looks like, and at the same time addressing some of the national security issues we have at home, starting on our southern border where we see the Mexican cartels carting over enough fentanyl that has led to 70,000 American deaths. That is top of the mind for Americans. I'll finish with this. Every county in this nation has become a border county because of the challenges that we have with fentanyl. I know that sometimes we think about 70,000 people, but here's the truth. When your friend, Alan Shaw, son dies of fentanyl 2 months ago, you start understanding that the numbers and the figures that we're talking about aren't just statistics. They're human lives that are being devastated and impacted by something that's preventable.
On the issue of abortion, you called the South Carolina 6-week ban good news for South Carolina. Would you support a 6-week national ban?
Yeah, what I've said consistently is I believe that life has intrinsic value because it comes from God. I'm 100% pro-life conservative. I have a 100% pro-life voting record. If I were president of the United States, I think my first objective on the issue of life is to cultivate a culture that protects life. I would stop radical states from having abortion on demand in the 40th week.
So would you sign a 6-week abortion ban?
Thank you for asking the question twice. But here's what I would suggest, that in order for us to be able to have a conversation about limits, let's start with a 40-week. Would you agree with a 40-week abortion?
I'm a journalist.
You have an opinion, though. So here's my point.
I'm also a woman.
Here's my point. Well, I mean, so you.
So I do have an opinion. Yes.
Yeah, of course. But I do too.
I mean, look, I've heard you answer with.
How about let me answer the question? I know you get to ask the question. I'm going to give you my answer to the question.
Go ahead.
And here's my answer. America will not find itself having a conversation. Listen, I've said on the campaign trail a dozen times, if I were president of the United States, I would certainly have a 15-week limit 72% of Americans agree with that position. I don't think any state should be allowed to have abortions up until the day of birth. That is my position. I've also said very clearly, because I think you have to tell the American people the truth, even the 15-week limit is not possible unless we change the hearts and minds of the American people, because it can't get through Congress. The current Congress today won't even pass a 20-week limit. Therefore, the conversation about how conservative you can go on the federal level is inconsequential if we don't figure out how to change the hearts and minds of the American people.
Let's do a rapid fire on former President Trump.
I'm a Southern preacher. It's hard for me to do rapid fire on anything.
Do you think he is fit to run for office again?
Who's that?
Former President Trump.
I think every candidate who wants to run for office has the right to run for office, and the American people will decide whether or not they are fit for office. Oh, by the way, I'm running for president, by the way, and I'm hoping that everyone here will vote for me too.
Yes, yeah.
I'm hoping to avoid having the conversation about who's fit, who's not fit, whether President Biden is too old.
What is your plan on breaking through the Trump noise? I mean, he dominates in the polls, he dominates on stage. What is your plan, since you're running against him, for defeating him?
Actually, I'm running for president. I think everyone who runs for president has to run for what they believe is in the best interest of the nation. I'm not as concerned about who's running against me as I am why I'm running for the American people. I believe America can do for anyone what she has done for me. My goal is to restore hope, create opportunities, and protect the America that we love. I have found that on the campaign trail, whether I'm in Iowa, New Hampshire, or South Carolina, that people respond constructively and positively to an optimistic message, as long as it's anchored in conservative principles, as well as having a backbone to tell people where you are on the issues that they care about.
If Trump were nominated, would you rule out serving as his vice president running mate?
To suggest that I would have to be someone's running mate is to suggest that I've already lost the race.
That's not what I'm suggesting.
No, I'm not saying I'm just saying the question suggests that. I would just say that I plan to be the nominee, and I will consider a number of people to be my vice presidential running mate.
Any names? Any names for you, for your running mates? Any names that we should know about?
Well, not yet. I've got 3 or 4 in my mind. I would say Trey Gowdy, but he lives in South Carolina, so he'd have to move in order for us to win. But no, I won't put him on the ticket.
Okay, that's fair. We're hearing Republican strategists, a lot of them say that the more candidates in the field, the better it is for Trump. Do you agree?
Yeah, I know that people are fascinated by President Trump, but when you're running for president, you should be fascinated about why it is that you're running and what you hope to do for the American people. So for me, I understand the fascination that media has. But here's the question I never get on the campaign trail. I've been on the trail now for several months of my Faith in America tour. I have not found 3 Americans who are asking me about President Trump. What I hear them asking me about is, will my child have a better future in this nation than I did? I hear them asking me about, why is it that you cannot figure out how to get people in Washington to control the southern border? I hear about the challenges that we have with crime going through the ceiling.
Let's talk about that. What would you do to address crime in big cities?
Well, I would elect different people, number one. I mean, so part of the challenge that we're seeing throughout the country right now, the big cities today are controlled by essentially a supermajority on their city councils and mayors who have consistently demonized, demoralized, or tried to defund the police. What we've seen as a result, Minneapolis is a great case in point, where the African-American community led the charge to stop the ballot initiative that was going to defund the police, even though the elected officials wanted to see more defunding of the police. We saw that here in D.C., where crimes were made. The rape in D.C. is up over 100%. Carjackings are through the roof. Violent crime is through the roof, and yet the city council wanted to reduce punishment for certain types of violent crime. Here's what we have to understand. Elections have consequences, and as a kid who grew up in a single-parent household, mired in poverty, with a few of my best friends either incarcerated or in the cemetery, I take this issue very seriously. Having better training and better resources so the best wear the badge is a part of the solution that we bring to the table. But you cannot demonize and demoralize the police and expect something good to happen in communities. And frankly, over 20% nationwide of positions in law enforcement are vacant today because you just can't get people to do the job. And that's one of the challenges that we saw manifest in Memphis, Tennessee, as it relates to folks who have been new on the job without the proper resources to get things done.
I wanted to ask you something, that's also deeply personal to me. What is the most recent form of racism you experienced, and what did it look like?
Well, I've given a speech on the floor of the Senate about being stopped over 20 times as an African American for simply driving while black. I would say that perhaps is the most important demarcation of discrimination that weighs heavy on the shoulders. Because what it suggests is when you find yourself in a position where you've done nothing wrong, but you are assumed guilty before proven innocent, it's a sting. One of the reasons why I was so invested in police reform and remain at the table today working on police reform is because I do think that 95%, maybe 97% of our officers want to do their jobs and go home to their families. If we can figure out, and this is what I did in South Carolina, I brought African American leaders and police leaders together all around South Carolina and had conversations with no cameras. When you get rid of cameras, people actually start leaning into conversations that they lean away with when the cameras are on. And so finding a way to have better training and better resources so the best wear the badge also includes having folks who are community leaders, particularly in the African American community, go on ride-alongs with officers so that they have a conversation and engaging and understand that there's no such thing as a typical traffic stop. When you end up knocking on a door at a domestic situation, it's the most dangerous situation an officer finds himself in. So when you marry together the fact that while I've been discriminated against, America's not a racist country, you marry those two together.
But there is systemic racism.
There is racism, obviously, but I don't think that systemic racism in the way that we define it today is real. What we are suggesting today as the systems of our country are still so embedded in racism that an African American or Hispanic person or an Asian person doesn't have the same right to be free and to live their lives and to be as successful as possible. Here we are, two minorities having a conversation with an audience that's 86% white, 7% African American, and 12% Asian. So here's what I would say. I would say that when you have a conversation about systemic racism, without understanding and not suggesting that you do or don't understand, but without understanding the root system of where that comes from, and to look at the progress of uprooting those systems of racism, I do not believe that we are systemically racist. I don't buy that. I have fortunately been alive in this body, believe it or not, for only 57 years.
But you do believe that racism is embedded in...
I do not think that, no. I believe that racism is embedded in the hearts of individuals, that this nation has fought tooth and nail to uproot it from our systems. So to suggest that America is just systemically racist is something I reject. And also, when Kamala Harris and Joe Biden were asked the same question about racism in America, they both came to the same conclusion. When Morgan Freeman was on a CNN interview with Don, he came to the conclusion, really? There are two African Americans sitting on CNN having a conversation about progress in America. So I reject that thought.
If I may, moving on, ask you about your family. The last single president was James Buchanan. He left office 162 years ago. What would you say to voters who may be hesitant to vote for a single man, talking about family values?
Well, I think we've all been children. So understanding family values is really kind of simple, number one. Number two, having had the opportunity to raise my nephew from the age of 7 until he's 32 years old now, gave me an opportunity to participate in the important role of making sure that my nephew, who was in a single-parent household, as I was, had the same good benefit. I had a mentor. I had the good fortune of coming into his life when his father and mother divorced. And so that young fellow turned out to go to Georgia Tech to get his degree in biomedical engineering.
He was the one at your lunch, right?
Yes, he was. He went to Duke and got his master's in engineering and management. And then he went to work for PricewaterhouseCoopers, got bored, and then went to medical school, and now is in his third year of residency. So here's what I would say, that the fact that half of America's adult population is single for the first time, to suggest that somehow being married or not married is going to be the determining factor of whether or not you're a good president or not, it sounds like we're living in 1963 and not 2023. I'm not sure why that conversation becomes so important when you're the single guy up there, but I will simply say that I probably have more time, more energy, and more latitude to do the job. I mean, my girlfriend wants to see me when I come home, but at the end of the day, the truth is that I am so thankful to be who I am, where I am. And I made a commitment. This is so interesting. I'm glad you brought this up. When I was a kid, I said, the first responsibility I have is to make sure that my mother, who worked those 16-hour days as a nurse's aide for barely more than minimum wage, had the kind of lifestyle and retirement that I could afford. I said I would not start a new family until I could support my mother in a position that I wanted to have her. Good news is, yesterday was her last day on the job after 50 years as a nurse's aide at the hospital. And I am her retirement account. And so I wanted to make sure I honored that commitment that I made to her before I started a whole new family. The good news is, as President of the United States, promises made, promises keep, you can count on me.
I have a few more questions. If China invades Taiwan, should the U.S. send troops? Yeah.
Never say we never do. Number one, I would simply say that the truth is that what we have been doing is really important as it relates to the Indo-Pacific. There are a couple thoughts I want to lay on the table before we get to the specific answer to the question. Number one, in the Indo-Pacific, having served on the Armed Services Committee a few years ago now on the Foreign Relations Committee, the one thing I will say is that we have about 11 to 12% of our military assets in the Indo-Pacific. That's problematic. But one of the things that we're seeing is a growing threat in the Indo-Pacific, and yet we do not have the resources there to respond in a rapid pace. So that's part of the challenge that we have there. Number two, our cooperation and collaboration and commitment with Japan is incredibly important in how we respond to threats in the Indo-Pacific, and we have a little work to do, in my opinion, of making sure. I was there in 2019, right before COVID hit, meeting with our ambassador leaders, our leaders in Japan. Such an important relationship as we still expand our presence and our Air Force presence for our readiness. It's so important. Number three, I would say that in the last recent months, you've all, I'm sure, read, this is an incredibly intelligent audience. I look around here and see some people that are really smart in the room here. I see some who are super smart on the front row here. What's up, buddy? I would say this, that our ability to continue to provide resources and to collaborate with the Taiwanese military is incredibly important. To make sure that they have the resources and the weaponry to defend themselves is incredibly important. I would simply say this at the end. Standing shoulder to shoulder with Taiwan is our obligation.
I have one big picture question, and it struck me in your book.
You read my book?
I did.
Which one?
I did. The one about your life. The memoir.
Oh, okay, that one. Yes.
Yeah. You taught in 1995. Young Tim Scott was trying to figure out if he wanted to run for office, and you talked about walking into the Democratic Party headquarters.
Yes.
In South Carolina.
Yes.
And you were told to get in line.
Yes.
And then you walked into the GOP headquarters.
Yes.
You were embraced. They said, "Let's go, Tim Scott."
Theoretically, that's exactly what.
Was it really that simple?
No, absolutely not. If I could write the whole story, I'd take more chapters in the book, and that was an important part of the equation. So here's what I would say, is that a kid that grew up in the African-American community, about 100% black community when I was a kid, and so everybody in my community were Democrats. And so I knew where I belonged, even though my philosophical disposition was very conservative, that the place you start the conversation if you're going to run for office as a black guy in South Carolina is on the Democrat side, even though my ideology was on the conservative side. And so I walked into the Democratic Party and said, hey, y'all. And they were like, what's up? I said, I want to run for county council. They said, you haven't served on any of the committees. You haven't paid your dues yet. So if you want to run, get in the back of the line and we'll figure this out. I said, wow. So I walked over to the Republican Party. I'm 28 years old, 27 years old. And I said, hey, y'all. They were like, I said, I want to run for county council. They said, you know you black, right? I haven't seen a mirror. They said, well, you can run, but there's never been a black person that's ever run as a Republican and been successful for anything countywide. There are no single-member districts. You've got to convince people to vote for you. I'm like, I'm signing up. They were like, if you sign up, we'll support you. And of course, they interviewed me first. Her name was Cindy Mosteller and Mark Hartley were the two. Mark Hartley was the chairman of the party back in 1994. And they said, you have the right principles. This is going to be hard for you, very hard. I fortunately won that race. And then, of course, a few years later, talking about racism, my last part of this very long answer, by the way, is in 2010 when I decided to run for Congress, I had the same experience again. They said, you know that Strom Thurmond's son is running for Congress already. I'm like, who's Strom Thurmond? Didn't say that, by the way. Said, you know Carroll Campbell Jr., the most popular governor in the last 100 years, his son, Carroll Campbell III, is already in the race. You do realize that your district is the place where the Civil War started. And you're going to run for what? I said, Congress. I can win. They were like, oh, you can't win. How do you beat those big behemoths? Well, I won 68-32 against Strom Thurmond's son. Because here's what's happened throughout America and specifically throughout the South. There is this evolution of the Southern heart that happened along the way, where people actually judge you, not on the color of your skin, but on the content of your character. That was a dream 50 years ago. And it's become more and more of a reality. Do we have work yet to do? Of course we do. But can we not stop and celebrate the tremendous progress, perhaps the most progress in the last 30 years than any other place on earth?
Thank you so much, Senator.
Yes, ma'am.
We very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you to our sponsor, Bank of America. Thanks to everyone who's joined us in person and online. We hope to see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you all.